get us back to the other. Um, Let me try this. Can you guys see it now or no? Oh yeah? You're watching it now?
Gotcha.
This is the cistern room at the distillery. This is the same room. It looks identical to it did in the beginning when we started filling barrels. And then it rolls down a path into beautiful Rick House number one, which was built in 1940. So that's Rick House number one. You guys can see the video, correct? Good.
Yeah, I think
Um,
we're just getting to the umbrellas. The blue.
oh wow. Yeah, it's choppy just like it was when you were trying to play it before. So I'll go ahead and stop it. Sorry guys. It's a cool video. We can maybe share it with everyone to enjoy at another time.
Yeah, we can probably send it out in an email to
Yeah.
everyone to watch at the end. So,
Okay. All right, so we're gonna go back to the slideshow. So Bardstown, Kentucky. Um, the Bourbon Trail is something that's famous. We have a huge tourist uh, population coming in to visit all of our beautiful distilleries in Kentucky. Um, we started in 1936, so the history we have is very hard to replicate. As I mentioned, we're still single family owned. The fourth and fifth generation in the Willett family are currently running things. Mr. Evan Colesveen married Martha Willett, daughter of Thompson Willett, that started everything. And his son Drew and their daughter Britt are the next generation that are continuing to carry the torch for the company. When they brought me on in March, I was the first salesperson that they had brought on board to help them grow and to get to that next level. A lot of what we're competing against don't have the international presence like we have, which I'll explain a little why and how we have such an amazing international presence to be able to get these amazing bourbons and whiskeys to you guys and across the world. So something that is very exciting to be able to share these around the world with you guys. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what makes bourbon bourbon. Why is it uniquely American? It is our official native spirit since 1964. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and the history of bourbon. I'm going to try and get back to this slideshow if it will allow me. All right, are you guys still seeing my screen share?
not at the moment.
Okay. Sorry, guys, we'll get this. I apologize.
All right, there's a delicious Bardstown whiskey to taste while we're at it.
Yeah, perfect segue, Emma. Guys, let's go ahead and start sipping if you haven't already. With our first whiskey, we're going to talk. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so we're back to the slideshow. So you saw that. I don't know if you saw that photo, but this is our beautiful distillery in Bardstown. Since 1936, as I mentioned, our first whiskey went in the barrel in 1937, started by our founder, Thompson Willett. He already was a third generation distiller when he started the distillery. Shortly after Prohibition. So we had this fun little social experiment in the United States that we called Prohibition, where we decided we weren't going to drink for almost 11 years. We weren't going to have alcohol available. It was illegal. That's when you had bootleggers running moonshine across state lines, being chased by the federals. It was a wild time, I'm sure. I like being able to just walk over to my bar and grab a nice bourbon or old fashioned. So after that, there was a lot of readjusting to get back. There was so many distilleries that closed down during that time. There's a few that still had proprietary rights to make medicinal whiskey and medicinal bourbon at that time. So it was definitely a wild era for us. And in 1933, that prohibition was repealed, and we got alcohol back. So a lot of these distilleries got back up and running after that time. And since that time frame, there was a lot of ups and downs in bourbon. The 50s and 60s were pretty good. The 80s and 90s were not good. We almost lost bourbon as a whole, as a category, which was kind of wild to imagine. The 80s and 90s are when the 80s specifically are when Mr. Evan took over the company. So our first bourbon went into the barrel in St. Patrick's Day of 1937. We've with Old Bardstown as our first label. So let's talk about what you guys are drinking. I've got a bottle here. I'm going to lay off on the drinking since it's 4 a.m. But the Old Bardstown is our original label. It is our same recipe that we used then, we use today. 72% corn, 13% rye, 15% malted barley. This label, Old Bardstown is a racehorse, so it's kind of fading out. You can see the horse on this one. This is actually the bottled and bond version that you guys are trying, which I'll talk a little bit about what that is. But the Old Bardstown label is our first label from the 1940s. That same mash bill, same recipe, same bottle label and design, that square bottle was the same that we were using back then. So we really wanted to keep that authenticity, which I think we've done with this label. Like I mentioned, this is going to be what we produce the most of with this recipe. We make 6 mash bills total, 4 bourbon, 2 rye. We're going to talk about those a little later as well. But this one being our original mash bill, a lot of what we do, Rowan's Creek, Noah's Mill, all the old Bardstowns are all using this recipe. 72 corn, 13 rye, 15 barley. I'm going to say it over and over again because you guys are going to remember this before we're done. So 72, 13, 15, that old Bardstown recipe, this is at 90 proof. So by law, bourbon has its own laws. That's what makes it uniquely, the native spirit. So by law, it can't go in the bottle any lower than 80 proof. So our lowest offering is going to be 90 proof, and then we kind of go up from there. When we're tasting today, we're going to be starting at our lowest proof and cheating up from there. Just kind of the way to keep your palate kind of aligned as you're tasting through, not starting at 130 something proof and then going back to 90 proof. It's going to taste like water if you went the opposite direction. So I like to try and taste in order of proof, being this at 90 proof to start out with. So 4 years old, 90 proof. This is kind of where we start. This is our intro to mix it with Coke at home. Doesn't matter to me. It's an easy drinker at 90 proof as well. So it's a good starter bourbon as well for people getting into. I wouldn't throw one of our barrel strength whiskeys at someone when they're just trying to tiptoe into bourbon. This is a great place to start. So our Old Bardstown label. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple of the other Old Bardstown labels we make because we do have a couple different under that designate of the Old Bardstown lineup. Old Bardstown was a racehorse that came from good pedigree and stock. He was a local legend, but he had like hip and bone issues. They swore he'd never win a race, and he ended up winning the Triple Crown one year. The Triple Crown is where you win the Derby, the Preakness. For those, you win all 3, so Triple Crown, and proved them all wrong. And so they wanted to give him his own label, and so the Old Bardstown label is in memory of the racehorse, Old Bardstown. Kentucky racehorse, other than bourbon, horses and racehorsing is the next most popular thing. It's a very big thing in Lexington, the Kentucky Derby. I still haven't been, but maybe this is my year since now I'm with Willett. And last year they said, "Oh, we have to go again. We're so tired of going to this Kentucky Derby thing." I'm like, "I'm happy to be your stunt double." A little way we have fun drinking bourbon and watching horses race and making a big party out of it, and it is quite a party. Old Bardstown label, our first label, our original, we refer to as our OG recipe. Here's some of the history right here. That distillery looks very similar to what it does today. In the 80s, when Mr. Evan took it over, they had actually originally they had sold to another company, an ethanol company, and almost closed up shop. And well, for 6 months, they did close up shop. That ethanol company came in and ripped out all the distillery equipment and then went bankrupt 6 months later. So that's when Mr. Evan, they're like, does anybody want to take over this distillery? Mr. Evan obviously raised his hand. We wouldn't be here talking today if it wasn't for Mr. Evan. He picked up that torch and used that legacy that he married into, marrying Martha Willett, and hit the ground running. So at first, when he took it over, he didn't have a still. He didn't. That beautiful building was gutted. So with the up and down of what bourbon was and the category potentially maybe even not making it, it was probably not a smart idea to invest in putting a still back up and running. But he had all those rick houses on the property. He had friends and neighbors and family all around that were making and producing bourbon still. So he's like, all right, well, I'm not going to worry about making my own. I'll just fill my rick houses with all your guys' whiskey. And so for the first until 2012, Willett was a non-distilling producer. or independent bottler. Those two terms are used for people that are getting the juice from somewhere else and bottling it under their own label. So a non-distilling producer or independent bottler. They're not a distillery. They're not making or producing liquid. Someone else is, and they're just packaging and bringing it to the consumer. So we were that for a long time. And not a negative thing. You know, again, we had friends and neighbors that were making plenty of bourbon, making plenty of good bourbon. Heaven Hill Distillery is right across the street. One of our other labels, Rowan's Creek, which we'll mention later, is literally a creek that separates us from Heaven Hill across the street. So all our neighbors were producing good bourbon at that time, and so we just started using our beautiful rick houses to store all their whiskey. We were going around. Mr. Evan was handpicking these barrels, so it was already, pretty accessible because nobody was really drinking it here in the States at that time. And so he had access and availability of some great whiskey. And so he started stocking those rick houses. So for the 90s and early 2000s, he had, probably one of the biggest collections of whiskey, was bottling it under certain labels. We still had the Bardstown labels. Pot Still Reserve didn't exist back then. And that's when he created his first four labels, which we'll do this. Scrolling through, you can see beautiful Pot Still, which we'll talk about here in a few. But we'll go to this slide, which I love given that. Can you guys see all the whiskeys lined up here? Yeah. So on the top right corner, you see all the old Bardstown labels. So that far right corner is going to be what you guys are sipping right now. The old Bardstown bottled and bond, and the opposite corner of that is going to be only available at the distillery and only available in Kentucky. I can't even get it down here in Florida. So anytime I go back to the distillery, I come back home with one of these. It's $27 US. That's kind of a good everyday drinker price point. And then in the middle, the more rounded bottle, you see the old Bardstown Estate. So that is going to be older juice at 6 years at 101 proof. So we're bumping up the age and bumping up the proof. That's my personal favorite out of the lineup, followed closely by Rowan's Creek. If you ask Drew, our distiller, what's his favorite, Rowan's Creek, he's without hesitation every time. So when Mr. Evan first released whiskeys under his own regime, if you will, he came out with the small batch boutique collection, which includes Rowan's Creek and Noah's Mill, Kentucky Vintage, and Pure Kentucky. Those are the four under the small batch boutique collection, where he had sourced these whiskeys. He was focusing on the batch, so we're blending. For us, a batch is 24 to 28 barrels. That's something that's going to fluctuate and change with every distillery and every producer. The term small batch is very, very broad. A small batch for us could be 25. A small batch for across the street could be 100. So that's a term that's used very loosely. But for us, it's 24 to 28 barrels in a batch. And these four whiskeys were the first thing that Mr. Evan brought to the world in the bourbon category. So each one of those is going to have a sticker on the back. Manu, I know a couple of these are all four of the small batch collection available in Australia. I'm just wondering what your availability is there.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. We don't have them all, but we just got the Pure Kentucky, which is great to have here. We also have a Johnny Drum Black Label. Very luckily, I think it's quite unique in the world
Very
to
lucky.
have that SKU. It just come in a couple of months ago to Australia. The one we're trying today was the Bouncetown. And then to the more regular, we've got those three are new for us in Australia, and we've got Johnny Drum Private, Rowan's Creek, Noah's Mill, Willett Rye for a long time now as well, the Pot Still.
Excellent. Excellent. I want to make sure that I'm not just teasing you guys, that you guys can actually go find these and drink them. So
just about the cask strength old Bardstown. I was like, I want that.
Yeah, there's a couple teases on here. So the small batch boutique collection, Rowan's Creek and Noah's Mill, Kentucky Vintage and Pure Kentucky. Rowan's Creek and Noah's Mill, both those labels were hand drawn by Mr. Evan. He's actually in the Bourbon Hall of Fame for his label work before anything else. So both of these labels he hand drew. I don't know if you guys are going to have this one available there, but there's a label called Very Old Saint Nick that's got kind of a Santa Claus on the label that he hand drew that label as well. And his fingerprints are all over the bourbon industry. He was the one pushing that rock up the hill when nobody was drinking bourbon in the U.S. He was the one that said, hey, well, if they're not drinking it here, let's start building international markets. And that's when he sent Kentucky Vintage and Pure Kentucky over to Europe. Again, kind of marketing genius. He hand drew the other two, Rowan's and Noah's. Kentucky Vintage and Pure Kentucky, you're going into a European market. You've got Kentucky written across the front of the label. And the Pure Kentucky is actually the shape of the state of Kentucky. So a better way to be very transparent to Europeans that really don't know what bourbon is and what's special about this, what's unique. It's just whiskey, right? So, I've really kind of tipped my hat to that kind of marketing genius with him of making it as user-friendly as possible. Hey, this is bourbon from Kentucky. Enjoy. Both those two labels got initially a bit more traction in the European market, where Rowan's and Noah's kind of was built a little bit more on the domestic market. So we have a little bit more brand recognition for those two. Those labels are unique. That hand-drawn label. Rowan's Creek, as I mentioned, is a creek that separates us from Heaven Hill. Noah's Mill is a mill on our property that was a functioning grist mill for a very, very long time, grinding up our grains. So Mr. Evan introduced those 4 labels, started building those in 2003. Drew, his son, joined the company. In 2006, Britt, their daughter, joined the company. Drew is our master distiller, and Britt is our president and chief whiskey officer. So that's the 5th generation, still, again, single family owned, which is very rare for a company our size to still be single family owned, which speaks a lot to what we do. When Drew came on and joined us, good segue here. When Drew came on and joined us, one of the first things that he did was created our wheated mash bill. So our wheated mash bill, it's not really allowing me to show you on the screen, is going to be used in our Pot Still Reserve. So this is a replica of our beautiful still that you guys saw, hopefully pictures of when we were, this is right above us. There's a picture. So what we did is we sent the blueprints from this bottle to a Italian glassmaker and said, make this into a bottle. And so we have our beautiful Pot Still Reserve. It's a very iconic bottle. We make it in the 750. We make it in the big 175. And we also make it in the 50 milliliter little minis. So very iconic bottle. This brand was launched in 2008. And once they put the still back into the distillery, so up until that point, they were still non-distilling producer and independent bottler. So in 2008, we put the still back up, and in 2012, got it running. So 2012, we started distilling again. So for the first inception of this package, what you're drinking now, it was a combination of source juice. And then once we had our own juice come of age, it was a combination of source juice and our own distillate. And in 2020, we switched the recipe over to 100% our own distillate and 100% our wheated recipe. So our wheated recipe is going to be 65% corn, 20% wheat. Remember, we already talked about our OG recipe, 72 corn, 13 rye. So we're swapping out wheat for rye as our secondary grain or our flavoring grain. Corn has to be dominant by law. That's what makes bourbon. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn by law. As long as it's 51%, meets some other criteria, has to be aged in New American oak, cannot be distilled at any higher than 160 proof, can't go into the barrel any higher than 125 proof, and can't go into the bottle any lower than 80 proof. So we kind of put a little there's guardrails there. There's guidelines that it has to be, once you check those boxes to become bourbon, then you're bourbon. All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. Is the phrase that I like to use to make people think all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon, because bourbon is its own classification of whiskey. You've got Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey, Canadian whiskey, American whiskey, but bourbon is its own category because of those rules. So with this one, go ahead and take a sip. Our wheated recipe, 65 corn, 20% wheat, 15 barley. This we do a barrel entry proof of 115. Remember, by law, it can't go in any higher than 125. But that doesn't mean you can't put it any lower than 125 either. When I originally was starting to learn about bourbon, I thought that by law, everybody, 125 was the number. Everybody just went in the barrel at 125. And then when it comes out, they use the water, the limestone filtered water to bring it down to whatever bottle strength they want to do. You can play with that barrel entry proof. So with our wheated, we go in at 115. With our OG recipe, we go in at 125. And with our rye whiskey, we go into the barrel at 110. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get down to the rye whiskey. But that is all distillers makers preference. So, those are intentionally varied. With the 110, with our rye, we put that in the bottle at batch strength. So whatever it comes out, we let the batch dictate where it lands on the proof. So it went in at 110, it could come out at 111, could come out at 107 after we're done blending the batch. And so that proof will vary a little bit. But if it's coming out at 110 and we're putting it straight into the bottle, we're not adding any water after aging. And so it's keeping a lot of that integrity instead of taking those flavors and then diluting them right away, which we do on this, which is not a bad thing, obviously, which we do on this barrel entry at 115, proof down to 94. So you're looking at our wheated recipe, 94 proof, and this is a blend of 5 to 7-year-old bourbons. So we'll talk about age, proof, and recipe when we're going through these, because that's where we really are going to get our distinct characteristics. Wheat has a very different taste profile than rye. Rye is spicy, edgy, a little jagged. Wheat is soft, mouthfeel, vanilla softness. So it's going to play very differently. I like to use the wine analogy. If these percentages were Cabernet Merlot and Shiraz, if you swap out that Merlot for another varietal, it's going to totally change the wine. Same with whiskey. If you swap out wheat for rye, or if you, really, we use, when we talk about Johnny Drum, we use one of our high rye recipes where we got 38% rye in the bourbon recipe, which is going to completely change that taste profile when you're introducing so much rye into the recipe. So, people ask the time, can you really taste, people that aren't, that are more novice, can you really taste the difference between the whiskeys? Yes, of course. I had my dad ask me that once, and he's an old timer. He's like, can you really tell the difference? And, I used pizza as an analogy and said, if you had Pizza Hut, Little Caesars, and his favorite place locally was Paisano, and best pizza, he swears. So I'm like, if you had those three pizzas lined up in front of you, could you tell the difference? He's like, well, of course I could. Like, it's the same with whiskey. If you had three completely different bourbons lined up in front of you, all with different recipes, potentially different aging, definitely different, yeast strains. There's so many different variants. You're going to taste the difference. You're going to see noticeable differences between the three. So, not all whiskey is made the same. So, what do you guys think of this one? Pretty tasty, user friendly.
Yeah, well, Ian's got a
Comes out
great
there from Ian and Karen. Thanks, guys.
Ian had a great tasting note of mint chocolate and wafers, and 100%. I had an Aero bar. I don't know if you get Aero bars in the US, but it's like a bubbly mint and then chocolate, and it's just light and airy. And I'm absolutely
There you go.
lovely mint note. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, so this is definitely an iconic bottle. This is our flagship. There's a lot of times that you see a pretty bottle like this, and the juice inside is a little overhyped. Our previous recipe, it got some pretty negative feedback at times. It was a blend of our OG recipe that was sourced and our wheated recipe, so more of a 4-grain whiskey. I personally haven't found many 4 grains that I enjoy. I believe the rye and wheat kind of battle each other for that second place, if you will, for the flavoring grain, and that rye and wheat battling can kind of come across in the whiskey. So we listened to feedback, and in 2020 we transitioned over to it being all of our own distillate and being 100% that wheated recipe. And you can tell if it's the old recipe or the new recipe. I'm going to try and go in. If you guys can see, there's a white chalk line that has 2 numbers in the front. If it's 20 or newer, it's going to be the new recipe. If it's 19 or older, it's going to be the old recipe. So 20 and newer, this one's 20 is 24, and then a couple numbers afterwards. So that's a way to show that if it's a new recipe, you guys should probably have most new recipe in your markets. All right, you guys ready to transition to the next one?
I reckon let's get us into whiskey number 3. That was delicious, and the bottle is it's one of those bottles. She's a showstopper. Like, you see it on a bar, you see it in a bottle shop, you're like, what on earth is that? And it's such a great accessible whiskey as well.
It is. So that was released 2008. 2020 went through the recipe change. And on this screen, the bottom left corner, you can see a black bottle with a purple capsule and some gold writing on it. That is our Willett 8-year wheated. So same juice you just tasted, but a blend of 8 to 11-year-old bourbons at 108 proof. It is a banger. It is so delicious. We just had our first release. It's one of the first line extensions, probably since Pot Still. No, probably since Small Batch Rye. So one of the first line extensions we've done in a long time. 2022 is the first release of that. Hopefully, maybe one day you guys will get to try that in your market. So next whiskey, there she is right there. We're going to skip over these. We talked about Noah's, Rowan's, Pure Kentucky, and here we are, Johnny Drum.
Tempting us with whiskeys we don't have.
Yeah, sorry to tease. Yeah, just ignore those. So Johnny Drum, this is also one of my favorites. So we're doing some fun things with this one. Number one, this is a label that's part of our kind of our legacy heritage collection. This is a label that's been around since the 1960s. So this is pre Mr. Evan and Martha, definitely pre Drew and Britt. The 1960s, we had this label. It was actually a private label for a distributor in California that they sold to a grocery chain as a private label. And the distributor, after 10 years, ended up going belly up. And so we didn't want to lose this label. And so we brought it back underneath our portfolio. So we got great history with this label. I really like it's kind of a classic, iconic label. It looks historic. But what we're doing here with this one is we're blending 2 mash bills. So I mentioned 6 mash bills that we produce, 4 bourbon, 2 rye. We talked about the OG mash bill, 72, 13, 15. We talked about our wheated recipe, 65, 20, 15. We also do a high rye bourbon recipe, which we're using in this one, which is 52 corn, 38 rye. So when you're swapping corn sweetness for rye spiciness, it's going to totally skew that recipe towards a spicy, edgy backbone to that whiskey. And we're blending that with our OG recipe, 65% of our OG recipe and 35% of that high rye recipe. Our 4th recipe that we make is going to be a high corn recipe that's used in Kentucky vintage. And that's going to be the high corn. Oh my gosh, there we go. 79% corn, 7 rye, and the rest barley, which sweet corn forward in that whiskey. So blending here with Johnny Drum. When you're blending in that high rye with an already, rye bourbon recipe, you're really giving it a spicy, edgy backbone. This is also a blend of 5 to 7 years at 101 proof. So we're jumping up to that 101 proof. We're going up from there as far as what we're tasting. This is, 100 proof is right around where I like to dabble personally. You don't have flavors diluted. There's plenty of flavors you can taste. You can still dilute it yourself if you want to. Throw a big cube in there, a little cold water to kind of bring it down to where it might be more palatable to you. I'm a big proponent of drink it how you like it. I'm not going to sit there and tell you how to order your steak. Don't tell me how to drink my whiskey. So if you want to make an old fashioned out of it, this guy, I love old fashions. I'm going to taste it neat. Then I might try an ice cube, but then I'm probably going to order it in an old fashioned. Not barrel strength, but something like this, old fashioned all day long. That spicy rye pairs beautifully with that cocktail, with giving it a nice backbone with that nice edgy rye to it. This is a nice little fun whiskey. If you haven't already taken a sip, please take a sip.
Yeah, this I used to work in a bar years ago, and this is before I knew anything about whiskey. And this was the whiskey whenever someone was like, oh, I want an old fashioned, but make I don't want your regular boring house bourbon. I would always grab this on the back bar because I was like, it is so rounded, spectacular. It's punchy enough that it can hold its own in an old fashioned. And I make my old fashions a bit strong as well, which was an indication that I was already going to be into neat whiskey. But yeah, it used to be my go-to. It's so cool. And the old school label vibes. I love them.
Yeah, we refer to it as the bartender's bourbon because it does show so well in cocktails. The bartenders like a little extra punch, so it's just the bar industry gravitate towards it. So hopefully you'll be able to try it in an old fashioned sometime soon. And this is the private stock, as Manu mentioned. We also have, and here's something that we don't get to play with that you guys do, is the Johnny Drum 86, the Johnny Drum Black. It's going to be a black square bottle like the old Bardstown, but it's going to be a black label with the horse on it. And we don't, that's international markets only. So we did save a few items that are only available in international markets. We don't have that available here. We don't plan to. So that's something that you guys get to play with on your own. So cheers on that.
Yeah.
Any questions on Johnny Drum?
I don't think we've got questions. Ian's on fire with the tasting notes.
What
If
do you
you
got, Ian?
guys have tasting notes in the chat, please pop them in because currently Ian is smoking you all. He's got that sourdough bread, definitely a spice of rye, coming in with turmeric and nutmeg. Turmeric is a great call. John agrees. Like
Wow.
it's that like herbal. It sounds crazy, but like it just kind of like tastes orange, but like of the color orange. Sometimes you taste something and you're like, oh, this tastes like a color, but in a really interesting way. And yeah, Johnny Drum has that bright, beautiful, like lovely orange vibe, which is probably why it was my go-to for old fashions. I was like, yeah, orange, this is great.
Sure. Makes sense.
But no, and it's definitely a bit of and I added some tasting notes. I was slot American whiskeys into one of two categories, either marshmallow or pickles. And I love marshmallow whiskeys, those like sweeter, like sticky, creamy kind of ones, or the pickle, like dill pickle, fennel, all that kind of stuff. This is definitely a pickle whiskey for me, but on the sweeter side of the pickle whiskey. So
Our rye, and that's that high rye. Our rye is very, very dominant with that green pickle, mint, fennel, and we'll get to that when we get to the rye, which is actually nice. Maybe that's a good segue. But yeah, that is something that is very dominant, and I feel like when people say they don't like our rye or when they get bad feedback on the pot still before, I think it's that characteristic of our rye that people are like, well, what is going on here? I don't know why I'm tasting pickles and fennel and and green flavors. So I think that is one of the characteristics that is uniquely us. Recipe plays a huge role in that, but I really feel like our rick house is on our property. In the wine region, they talk about like microclimates and certain wineries and vineyards being on microclimates. I feel that we have our own microclimate. We're the highest point. We're on the hillside. You literally come up a big driveway to get to the distillery. We're getting the sunlight first. We're getting the breezes coming through the rick houses. I feel like for our aging and what we do, 80% of what they say 80% of what you're tasting is coming from the aging in the barrel, the color, the taste, the flavors. Barrels, it puts all the good flavors in, it takes all the bad flavors out, it filters. So, when you have that microclimate that we do, the aging, it's doing a huge bit of what our biggest characteristics are, I think is really coming from that microclimate that we have aging these whiskeys.
yeah, amazing. Manu's got a great kind of little prompt about that the Johnny Drum used to have a 15-year-old age statement. What's kind of the maturation length on it today?
So since it's our own distillate, this is going to be a blend of 5 to 7 year old bourbons. Previously, most all in the initial releases, like Rowan's Creek was a 12, Noah's Mill was a 15. When again, we had plenty of this amazing whiskey available, and nobody was really drinking it. Evan was one of those. He's like, if people aren't drinking it, let's just leave it in the barrel and let it get older and get older and get older. And that's why we've got and have, we'll talk about that. Access to 12 and 15-year-old barrels is because nobody's really drinking it. And so we had to make something special about it to get, oh, it's a 12-year, it must be nice, because nobody was drinking it. And nowadays, people would, if you could find a Johnny Drum 12-year age statement, I can only imagine on the secondary market what it'd be going for. So it's something I wish we could still, like, some of my states still have it in their system, their computer system, that Rowan's Creek is a 12-year. I'm like, I've never even seen that bottle. Like, can we update your system, please? Because we just had availability of that stuff. And when we'll talk about this too when we get to the family estate stuff of why the initial notoriety of why they got to be so special, and we'll talk about that because we had access to all this beautiful aged whiskey in our rick houses.
Yeah, it kind of feels like that thing of, those were really the golden years when people weren't drinking it. So the people who were got like just some incredible quality
Oil.
stuff And it feels like that moment of like, man, I should have been out there buying and drinking old American whiskey instead of, I don't know, being in primary school, elementary school. It's like, damn it.
Should have started earlier.
Exactly.
All right, so we went through the old Bardstown, talked about our original recipe, our OG recipe. We did Pot Still Reserve, had a great representation of a wheated bourbon, which is a very popular category of bourbon, those wheated recipes, because they are so different than the rye recipes. We just did Johnny Drum, and now we're going to do the first of our family estate. Originally, we were going to have the rye last, but since I like to do an order proof, we're going to throw it in the middle here. So we're jumping from bourbon over to rye. This is a slide for our small batch rye, but it's a great way to kind of talk about what we're doing here and what you guys are tasting and sampling. So anything that has our family crest on it is going to be part of our family estate line. So that was one of the wheated recipe, and both these rye recipes are what Drew has brought to the new generation. So he came up with that wheated recipe when the popularity of, a few other labels that we have over here, Weller is a brand, Pappy Van Winkle, I'm sure you've heard of. Those are all wheated bourbons. So that popularity of the wheated recipe, Drew saw that. I came across an article from probably 2010, something around there, that the title of the article was Bourbon Boy Genius. And it was an article about Drew. And kind of talking about what he has brought to the table, coming in as the new youth and young generation within the family and the company. Like we all have our name badges, our scan things to get around the distillery. My Instagram is Whiskey Gorilla, so I have like this Donkey Kong logo that I use for Whiskey Gorilla. His is Willy Wonka. So he is the Willy Wonka wizard, the mind. His mind is brilliant the way it works. And especially with this rye here. So there are two rye recipes that he came up with. Is one that has a good amount of corn introduced in it, 11%. So 74% rye, 11% corn, 15 malted barley. And then we make a secondary rye recipe that's barely even a rye, 51% rye, 34% corn. So one of the unique things to point out there is that, one, we're using corn in our rye recipe. A lot of the recipes that are being used are like 95% rye, 5% malted barley, or even 100% rye. And if you think about how bold rye can be, that spicy, edgy, bold flavor, when you have 100% of it, it's like getting punched in the mouth with a big grain of rye. And you need a little, and I agree with this personally for my taste, a little corn to balance it out. Kind of tone down that spiciness and edginess, interject a little bit of sweetness from the corn. If you look at that recipe, it's almost like the reverse of what our other recipes are, just swapping the corn and the rye. Always got to have that barley. Barley is the hall monitor, if you will. It's kind of what keeps everybody in check and playing well on the playground. Rye is very, very difficult to distill. It produces a lot of this enzyme that comes across foamy bubbles. It comes out of the still like chocolate milkshake if it's not balanced right. So barley has this enzyme, amylase, that keeps rye toned down and helps break down all those that air and gas and bubbles that's causing the difficulties when you're distilling. So barley is the hall monitor, keeping everybody in check. That 15% is a little higher percentage than most people will use. 10% is usually what you see, but we like to introduce that barley in there to kind of balance it all out. And as I said, kind of keeps those other grains in check in distillation. So the small batch is using both those recipes. The whiskey you guys are tasting today is using that first recipe, that 74% rye, 11% corn, 15 malted barley. So our family estate small batch, which is labeled a 4-year, is going to be a blend of these two recipes and a blend of 24 to 28 barrels, which is what our batch is. What you guys are tasting is from 1 barrel. So that is a 7-year-old version of our rye, 74 rye, 11 corn, 15 barley, aged to 7 years and bottled at barrel strength, which again, remember, we go into the barrel at 110 barrel entry proof. So wherever it lands for us. So with this, it's actually fairly low. So I can kind of imagine what some of the taste profiles are, since obviously I don't have that one right in front of me. I really enjoy some of the 7 years that we have coming out. To me, that 6 to 8 year is really kind of a sweet spot with bourbon, especially Kentucky bourbon. Um, by law, to call it straight bourbon has to be 2 years, 4 years to not have to put the age statement on it. If it's any younger than 4 years, if you're only aging 3 years, which why bother? 3-year-old whiskey, you have to put 3 year on there. It needs at least 4 years. I'm going to judge you immediately if you're putting 2 and 3-year-old bourbon into the bottle. Just wait another year till it hits 4. But once you start hitting that 6 to 8 year maturation, it's really when the flavors are really starting to get into their own. So these 7 year ryes just really hit for me personally. You get that green side, you get that dill, you get a little bit of those herbal sides. Sometimes people say, mint, whether that's peppermint or spearmint. There's different variations. Like I love the flavor wheel when you can look under, baking spices broad. I'll just say, oh, I get a lot of baking spice, but there's so many things that fall under baking spice, from clove all the way over to cinnamon and nutmeg and everything in between, where it's like, okay, you pick up a baking spice, but which, and then if you can narrow it down to which baking spice. You guys threw out turmeric. I'm gonna have to go revisit, Johnny Drum again and see if I can kind of pick that out. And if you're not tasting that, if you're not tasting dill, or if you're not, it's okay. The more you try and taste whiskey, the more your palate gets refined. It's a muscle, so you have to train and refine your palate to be able to taste those things. I mean, I remember the first time I drank beer. It's like, tasted disgusting to me. I have a different opinion of it now. I love beer. But same with bourbon, like the first bourbon I ever tried was Maker's Mark, because that's the only thing my dad had in his cabinet. And I don't really remember the first time I drank it, but I remember I probably coughed a couple times, and that was just 80 proof bourbon. So I believe we're at like 104, 103 proof on this. Where did we land? It's like 51, 52.
1.2%. So that's what.
Okay, so we lost a bit of alcohol in that. It went in at 110, came out at that. So a lot of times you'll see losing more water than alcohol. Losing the alcohol, that's the angel share. That's what goes up to the heavens, that the angels can have their parties. And with this, we actually, depending on where it was in the rick house, we actually lost more alcohol than we did lose water. But we didn't add any water when it went into the barrel, so it is straight as it was out of the barrel. We do non-chill filter, and try and give it to you the best representation we can, in its purest form, and that's at barrel strength right out of the barrel. So 7 years on the age, 74 rye, 11 corn on the recipe. And what do you guys think of it?
Yeah, everyone's getting the mint note. I think, like,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's very dominant.
I don't know, like it's that big fisherman's friend kind of, like you take a sip and then you breathe out and it just feels cool in your mouth. That like similar sensation that spearmint kind of gives you.
Yeah.
Matthew's getting like a lingering grassy fresh tobacco finish. John Picot's getting some grassiness and some light cola. I can kind of see that, like the sour cola candies, where they're like a little bit sweet but a little bit kind of like zesty, I suppose, like
Yeah.
when you're sucking on them. At Cameron, definitely mint and grassy notes. I think it's across the board, it's grass and mint and just freshness, which is definitely needed in this hot weather down in Australia, which I'm still adjusting to. But
Yeah.
I've got a bit of a question, which is adjacent-ish to the whiskey. Are family crests a big thing? So we often think about like these big family lineages in Kentucky. And I don't know if I've ever seen a crest before. And obviously the Willett crest is such a eye-catching standout thing. Is there kind of a story behind it, or is it just...
There is. Thank you for teeing that up for me, Emma.
Oh yeah.
There is. So anything that dons our family crest is going to be part of our family estate line. So if it's got a green capsule, it's going to be rye. If it's got a purple capsule, it's going to be bourbon. On the street, they refer to the purple capsule as purple tops. We prefer Willett Family Estate single barrel. But that family crest is, something that's very important to us. The family crest was actually given to the Willett family from Queen Elizabeth I. So the family started distilling in the 1700s in France, making cognacs and brandies. Then they moved to England. The next Willett family members was a pewtersmith, and he was a pewtersmith making crowns and stuff for the Queen. Let's see if I can zoom in here on it. You always see the bird and crown as one of our main logos. Actually, yeah, you can see the bird and crown on my shirt here. That is, it is the bird is actually a Willett bird, which is more of a seagull. It's not a goose. Everyone thinks it's a goose, the Willett goose, but the bird and crown is a symbol that we use a lot as well. But that was his pewter stamp. So whenever he would make his creations, the bird and crown was his stamp that he would stamp uh, on his items after he would produce them. And then the family came over to the States. They say that there were some of them on the initial boats coming over, the colonizers. The Willett family, Lambert Willett was Thompson's father, moved to Kentucky right when it became a state, which was, I think, like 1792. So they've been in Kentucky making whiskey through the 1800s and into the 1900s. So that family crest was originally, came over from England and was given to us from Queen Elizabeth I.
Super.
It is a very iconic family crest, and that's a very good point. I don't know of many other brands that are using any family crests in the bourbon world. There's maybe some wineries that do, but yeah, it is something that's very iconic.
Yeah, it's such a great indicator of like, this is something that represents us. And even if you saw that you out in the wild on something that wasn't a bottle of Willett, you'd probably be like, that looks familiar. That's yeah, it's that. And with the green and purple differentiation as well, I think is so clever.
Yes. Yeah, they did a really good job with that. And that family estate line was put out in 2010-12 time frame. The family estate small batch rye was first bottled in 2015. So initially, the family estate was what they were putting a lot of those older age statements, those whiskeys that Mr. Evan had been sitting on, letting get older and older. So that's kind of perfect segue again. That's kind of where the lure, the fame, and kind of elusiveness of the family estate line was when they first started bottling some of these 21-year-old, 25-year-old, 27-year-old whiskeys that Mr. Evan had just been sitting on in the rick houses, and again, trying to make it, plate it up and cut the meat is for the consumer of putting it in our family estate, and our family estate label, and putting some of those age statements out there. And when those first started getting released, that's when people were like, whoa, what are these guys doing? And then, they started tasting some of the juice. And, if um, those whiskeys were initially identified as being special when they were set aside to age longer. So, once you get, to a few single barrels remaining of something that old, they've been set aside for a reason. They've been, marked that these are special. These are something that we're going to hold on to and release as a special item. And it's not just a lot of these sourced whiskeys today. They're like, yeah, we'll take whatever you can give us. They're not being selective, and even when it comes down to single barrels, it has to meet certain requirements in order to get to this level to be in the single barrel program to begin with. If not, it would have just been dumped off and used in Johnny Drum, or dumped off and used in Old Bardstown. Anything else that uses that OG recipe, which is what we're going to be tasting today. So these from the beginning were already identified as something special. So once they get to this 11-year mark, or 7-year mark, they are the best that we make. So let's go ahead and jump over into the purple side of it. Willett Family Estate single barrel bourbon, also known on the streets as purple tops. I found out the hard way that Drew doesn't like them to be referred to as purple tops. So I can't help but it slips out when I'm like, yeah, with those purple, I mean the Willett Family Estate single barrels, but refer to it however you want to on the street. Um,
Just
they,
not.
as I mentioned, initially that's kind of how they got the lure and the fame was because, the only thing we would put in there was our utmost oldest and best that we had available. And we would release them and just like most other brands, 20 years ago it was sitting on the shelf for $80. It's now they're $2,000. So it the boom of bourbon in the States, definitely made some of this stuff a lot less available. And that's when you start finding these things on the secondary market. So for us, secondary market is not a good thing. Somebody that goes and stands in a line at our distillery to buy a bottle and then goes out in the parking lot and they're posting a picture of it from their car for four times what they just paid for it at the distillery, just flipping bottles. And it's, once, and then there's both people are at fault, the person selling it and the person buying it. Because the person buying it for $2,000 when it's a $150 bottle is not helping it at all either because they're now putting that evaluation on it because they paid for it. Just because they paid $2,000 for it, I'm just throwing random numbers out, obviously, doesn't mean that's what it's worth. It's something like that is worth only what someone's willing to pay for it, right? So that really got ugly for a while with some of the secondary that we would come across because people were hunting for these releases that we would come out with, and they would pay absorbent amount of money on the secondary market. It still blows my mind, and they would pay this money and take it home and put it on their shelf and look at how pretty it is. They're trophies. And these whiskeys, all whiskey is made to be drank. It's made to be opened. It's made to be enjoyed. Sitting on your shelf, I only have one or two unopened bottles on my in my house right now. I mean, samples in the garage, but I mean, of those type of bottles that you see people posting pictures of their collection, and it's all unopened bottles, and it's just like, oh, how do they taste? Oh, you wouldn't know because you don't open them and drink them. Like they're made to be drank. That is one thing that Drew is adamant about because obviously with the secondary market, we're very, very gun shy to it. We keep very close to the vest with our releases and who gets them because we don't want people to turn around and put secondary prices on them on the retail shelf. We want them to make their way to your bar and they want them to be opened and enjoyed. That's what they're made for. So people showing me pictures of their collection don't impress me. Show me pictures of your open bottles that you've enjoyed with friends. That impresses me. So it's made to be drank, open, and enjoy them. So switching from rye back to bourbon, both of these selections today are going to be our OG recipe. So 72 corn, 13 rye, 15 barley. These are both 11 years old. And the proofs on these, if you guys can assist with the proofs.
So the ABV of the one we're tasting now is 65.7%. And I mean, it's up to you, Christopher, whether you recommend. I would almost kind of go side by side comparison if you have the chance.
Sure. Yeah, they're close enough. Sure.
The 67.5% ABV one. I think it's a great way to showcase nuance. We in the kind of regular consumer space, we're so exposed to whiskeys that have been batched together in tens of thousands of liter batches or whatever it happens to be for core range releases. So you kind of miss the differences from batch to batch, and this is such like a great standout showcase of how two seemingly very, very identical whiskeys can be so different and so incredible in their own right.
Definitely. And I agree, putting them next to each other kind of in this tasting and just kind of see their differences because these are these are the same make and model, if you will. Same mash bill, but the differences could be where they're aged in the rick house. You've got 5 floors. Each floor has its own characteristics. The first floor, think of it as the basement. The top floor, think of it as the attic. Totally different climates. You've got cold, damp, close to the earth for the first floor. So you pull in some of those mellow, earthy flavors sometimes. Um, Top floor, hot, humid attic. Each time you go up the next floor, you just start sweating a little bit because the humidity it's that drops. It's kind of wild the climates between each floor. So one of these barrels could have been first floor, one could have been fifth floor. Um, Totally different styles and characteristics put into it. One of these barrels could have been close to the window, getting some sunlight in and starting to warm up earlier, or getting a breeze. It could be right in the center where the walkway, where the breeze is coming through. There's so many variables that contribute to to what you're tasting or what you're not tasting in each one of these barrels. Um, and that's again, I kind of touched a little on the microclimate. Our rick houses are. Um, they're doing their thing and they're a big part of what makes Willett Willett. Um, I can also touch on real quick. We also have a secondary distillery under construction with 7 additional rick houses. That's in Springfield, Kentucky, about 20 minutes outside of Bardstown. It is close enough to the existing distillery where it's going to fall under the same DSP instead of having to create a whole new distillery license. So every time we would transfer from distillery A to distillery B would be taxes and codes and everything else. So it's still under the same DSP. We already have one of those rick houses filled, and that secondary distillery is going to be up and running fall of next year. So that's going to take us from producing about 25,000 barrels a year to about 75,000 barrels a year. And another big game changer for us in availability was the new bottling line that we put in right after COVID, actually. They ordered this new bottling line in 2020, 2021 from Italy. And initially, when we bought it, they send it over and then they bring their people over to assemble it. It was COVID. Nobody's traveling from Italy. So they literally were like, looking through the instructions, like, all right, go A into B. And they used their team locally and somehow put this bottling line together. But it went from what we used to be able to bottle in a day, we can now bottle in an hour. So that alone, just the availability and before we had plenty of juice, we had rick houses full of juice, but just the process of getting it into the bottle and getting it labeled, packaged, and out the door was the obstacle. So new bottling line, game changer, new distillery up and running. We're not going anywhere. We're making plenty of juice. We've already laid down plenty of juice, so we're going to have it coming your guys' way, and even more so. So that's something that with this boom, we've started producing more. A lot of the older distilleries like us are catching up with the demand with this supply, and I think the biggest obstacle in the past was the supply and the demand. There wasn't enough supply for the demand, but that's being righted. So now a lot of these new brands that have popped up that are sourcing from somewhere else and have only been around for 2 years or 5 years, maybe. I don't think that those brands are really going to make it. I don't think you'll see many of those brands in your markets anyway, but we're not going anywhere. So Willett Family Estate Single Barrel, aka Purple Top. What do you guys think of them?
I mean, the differences are so distinct. The first one was all Arizona peach iced tea on the nose, and it was that American peaches kind of thing. But the second one instantly was chocolate for me. Ian's got cola cubes and creamy tiramisu for the
Sounds good.
one, and for the first, and then the higher proof is creamier with a subtle coffee, like cold coffee note. Yeah, kind of like nitro coffee almost. But yeah, absolutely incredible. And yeah, the difference is really stark. Ian also recommended what's the thought on the potential for expensive bottles to be opened at the bottle shop on purchase and then reclosed for people to take home. I know that there's some brands, there's one in Scotland where they keep they're very small production, but they keep a list of everyone who buys a bottle. And if they see that they've sold it on a secondary market, they've numbered the bottles and whatnot, they're like, oop, you don't get an allocation next time.
No-fly list.
Yeah.
Oh, I strongly approve that of putting people on the no-fly list, and that's a great idea. Literally, one of my friends I saw yesterday had a store down the street that he's like, oh, they're trying to get $5.99 for it. I offered him 400 cash, and this is for a family estate, and that was my thought. I was like, going in and tell him you'll open it in the store, and that he might change his attitude, because when they automatically think you're going to try and flip it, they've been burnt so many times that they're like, I'm not going to sell it to you at a better price because you're just going to turn around and make that extra money up when you flip it. So opening it in the store to prove that you're a drinker and not a collector or a flipper is a smart way to do it. And now I think I am going to reach out to my buddy and say, offer him to open it in the store and see if he
Yeah.
takes your offer.
Yes.
Because that is, you're not gonna be able to sell it on the secondary. You're proving that you're gonna open it and drink it, and that's what it's made for. So, definitely approve that.
Yeah. It's really tricky out there for like people who genuinely do want to drink it and open and share it. For that secondary market to be there kind of stepping away. But yeah, please add in.
Another thing I kind of wanted to point out that could be some of the differences. I've picked a few barrels now in my day, and that's actually my first barrel pick I ever did at Willett. That's one of the only things I don't have open. It's an 8-year that I picked with one of my customers. That one is not open. That and Angel's Envy bottle signed by Lincoln Henderson is not open. Those are the only two in my entire bar. So I was just there recently with my Florida distributor picking a barrel, and the lineup, and we're going through and picking barrels, and we identified one or two. And then our barrel captain, Josh, who does an amazing job with these, was like, what was it you liked about it? And so we kind of told him what we were looking for. He's like, all right, I got one for you to try. So he kind of gauges you and then decides where he's going to go next to take you down the path on what you're going to taste. So he brings out a couple more options, and there was one that just stood out above the rest. It was just big, bold. It had front, it had middle, it had finish, just hitting on all cylinders. And I was there picking with my distributor, and we were just talking about, it's big and bold, and then we started referring it to, like, oh, she's thick, like that girl's thick, and just started talking about this whiskey. And he's like, do you know why? And we're like, please enlighten us. So, with our sour mash process, we keep back set from previous yeast to start fermentation of the next batch. And with this specific batch, they used a rye back set to start the fermentation instead of using a bourbon back set. So that right there is going to completely spin the flavor wheel. And that using that rye back set, it brought in more bold, more spice, kind of more backbone to the whiskey. And just changing the yeast back set from a bourbon to a rye completely could change things as well. And that with our single family estate, all of them have kind of a name across the back where people will have some fun naming barrels. I try and have some fun with it as well. I've named one as the logo, the bird and crown. Everyone thinks it's a goose, so we named the barrel "It's Not a Goose." And this one, because it was so big and thick, we named it Rubenesque. So Rubenesque, Ruben was a painter. He painted all big, thick women. And there's also a Sopranos episode where everybody made fun of one of the guy's wife for being big. And he's like, I love that woman. She's Rubenesque. And so Rubenesque is the name of this barrel that we picked. And that rye back set just played, just giving an extra, jolt of characteristic to this barrel, and it was delicious.
Yeah, that's incredible. There might be a hidden magic in that, do a rye run, then a bourbon run, then a rye run, so that you've
For
got
sure.
that.
And the fact that they're experimenting to find out, like, that's the only way that you're going to find if, hey, is this going to work? I don't know. Let's try. Like, and there's different things like that you can. Another one that for some of the 11-year ryes, the 7 years were 110 barrel entry, but we did a batch that were 125 barrel entry on the ryes. So some of these 11-year ryes are coming out like 136, 134, which for a rye, I mean, these are just big spice bombs, but they're delicious in their own way. So, going from a 7-year to 11-year completely changes that rye whiskey. Same with the bourbon, adding that extra time in the barrel, letting it do its thing. It's going to completely, change that taste profile.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'm about to, now that we're at the end, and we've hopefully everyone's delved into all their whiskeys and has compared the last two of them. I'll run the poll so you can pick your top 2 favorites of the night. But if you wanted to quickly pop in the chat, which was your favorite out of the 2 family estate bourbons, the 65% or the 67%, pop that in the chat because I'm really curious to see which one everyone prefers out of the 2 of them. And then I will run the poll right now so that we can get a vibe for the favorite of the whole evening. So just a heads up, Christopher, we can both see how people are voting. It's like
Oh, cool.
It's kind of like a horse race rather than I normally say greyhound racing, but it's like the horse race of watching how people's votes go, and then when everyone's popped their vote in, we can do a drum roll and announce the winner of the night. But
look at Johnny Drum.
I don't know. And what was the comments? Ooh, it's pretty bloody close between the 2 bottlings. I think there's a slight edge on the 67 percenter. I personally think the 65 percenter is my pick of the 2. So yeah, pretty even split, which is what I love to see, and that's amazing. But yeah, another quick aside as well, in terms of bottles and your favorite bottles. We have a small amount, I believe, that Manu has very kindly sorted for us. But I think we're going to be trying to get our hands on some extra stock. So if there's something you particularly loved, absolutely want to get your hands on, I'm just sharing Ollie's email in the chat. Go bug him. Send Ollie an email and we will sort out and see if we can't unite you with your whiskey of choice. But I think we've got all the answers are in, and this is very close. This is fabulous to see. So drum roll, and we have a tie between the Family Estate Rye 7 and the last Willett Family Estate Bourbon for first place. So that's amazing to see that, like, 2 obviously distinctly different styles.
For sure.
Normally the first ones don't get as much love, but they still got, a little bit of love in this one. And then yeah, the Johnny Drum and the first bourbon coming in a tied second. That's the hard thing about like these tastings where everything in the lineup is incredible. So it's sort of like, oh, it's pretty much minimal 1 or 2 votes difference between the top whiskeys. So it's fantastic to see. But and Matthew saying, Johnny Drum is a staple, got him into Willett. But yeah, and Ollie's just added as well that the Willett family estates are in high demand and very limited. So yeah, get emailing him, first come first served, and we'll do our best to get you a bottle. But I think that kind of, we're out of whiskey now. It kind of comes to a sad end. I think that we could probably talk and drink American whiskey and Willett whiskey for a little while longer. But massive thank you to you, Christopher, for joining us. If everyone wasn't aware, it is the crack of God knows what in the morning. So he's coffeed up to join us tonight. So thank you very much. And yeah, we will see you all in the next tasting. Thank you so much for joining. Christopher and Manu, I want to hang around a little bit longer. I know I've already stolen most of your morning, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Take care.
Amazing, and happy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Christopher.